history of House Targaryen is written in fire. It is the history of a bloodline risen from blood and ash, of an ancient inheritance carried from across the sea, of a web of power woven through thrones and dragons, reaching into the deepest roots of dynasty and dominion. And with every generation, that history is shaped anew. With every child, it is tested again. Some are born and pass quietly into the current of their house, fading in time like the branches of a river. Others are a disturbance from the moment of birth, a force that fills everything around them with its presence, a tremor that can be felt even in the walls of the palace. Daemon Targaryen was the latter, and before we descend deeper into the story, you can write in the comments where in the world you are listening tonight, and at what hour. It was the year 81 after conquest. In the Crown Lands, the long and heavy shadow of Jaehaerys Targaryen's reign still held sway. This aged king, who had sat the Iron Throne for more than half a century, ruled over one of the most stable ages Westeros had ever known. There was peace, yes, but it was the kind of peace that concealed great tensions and silent fractures beneath its surface. The dynasty was strong, the dragons still moved across the sky, and law and order had spread through the 7 kingdoms. Yet beneath the throne, the question of succession had already begun to swell like an unseen sore. Death had passed early and mercilessly among the children of Jaehaerys, and each of those losses had left the future of the throne more uncertain, more disputed, more obscured. It was into the very heart of this dynasty that Daemon was born, but not at the foot of the throne itself. One step behind it. His father was Daemon Targaryen, the son of Jaehaerys, known as the Spring Prince, a man of courage, loyalty, and warlike strength. Balon was among the brightest promises of his house, a dragon rider upon Vhagar, a prince who had drawn his sword for the realm time and again, and, in his father's eyes, by far the most trustworthy heir. His mother was Alyssa Targaryen, Balon's sister, and in the fashion permitted by Targaryen custom, both his wife and his own blood. Alyssa, too, was a dragon rider. She had taken to the skies upon Melis and carried within her, all her life, a spirit too large to be contained by the limits of the court. By all accounts, she was fearless, sharp of tongue, and little inclined to bow before the shapes expected of her. And that detail is not a small one, for to understand the fire that would one day burn untamed in Daemon's veins, one must see that it was fed not only by his father's courage, but by his mother's defiant spirit as well. Daemon was the second son born of this marriage. The first was Viserys. That order, first and second, was the beginning of a pattern that would shape the rest of his life. Viserys was the elder brother. Viserys stood one step higher in the line of heirs. Viserys was gentler, more yielding, more easily accepted, and Daemon was always one step behind. That distance, imposed by birth itself, would shape not what he did, but what he felt for the rest of his days. Even as a child, he was aware of it, or at least he felt it, in some instinctive way. It was the kind of knowledge a child cannot yet understand, but carries in the body all the same. The sense that something which ought to have been his was always being offered first to someone else. Yet that distance did not build a wall between Daemon and Viserys. On the contrary, the bond between them took root in childhood in a way that was strong, sincere, and already quietly complex. Viserys was a gentle, conciliatory, affectionate boy. Daemon was quick, sharp, and impossible to keep still. They may have been opposites, but that contrast did not drive them apart. At least in the beginning, it drew them toward one another. Viserys was the calming force. Daemon was the one who provoked. Viserys was the one who loved. Daemon was the one who demanded love. The balance that formed between them would, in the years to come, sink roots deep enough to shape even the fate of the realm. But in those early days, within the walls of the court, that bond was still nothing more than the innocence of brotherhood. Two boys running the same corridors, swinging swords in the same yards, and holding fast to one another beneath the shadow of the same dynasty. Even then, Daemon was already different, not in some harsh or obvious way, but in a manner that could be felt, like that brief and uneasy stillness in the air just before the wind changes direction. He did not like to sit in silence. His submission to rules was always delayed, always the sort that came with clenched teeth. His way of learning felt less like learning than remembering. There was a natural violence in him, the kind that could be restrained, but never ignored. When maesters and septus spoke of him, they lowered their voices. Their complaints were never entirely concrete, and yet there was always a warning in the tone. The boy was too clever, too quick, too proud, and most dangerous of all, he was too impatient. This impatience was not the ordinary temper of a restless child. Daemon's impatience was the anger of one who felt that a certain greatness had already been promised to him and had not yet arrived. Even at so young an age, he carried an energy that refused to be ordinary. There was a spark in his eyes that seemed to say the world around him was not enough. The ceremonies of court life wearied him. The slow pace of protocol stirred his anger. What he wanted was movement, defiance, and echo, for his presence to leave a mark, for his name to be heard, for his power to be felt. This was the rawest form of dragon blood as it lived within a child. House Targaryen was a world that promised greatness to its children, yet taught them from the beginning the price that greatness would demand. From the moment Daemon first opened his eyes, he lived beneath the shadow of dragons. Within the walls of the Red Keep, the hard lines of the throne, the cold gleam of blades born of Valyria, and the weight of a bloodline written in fire and blood were everywhere. To grow up in such a place allowed no ordinary childhood. At court, every glance measured, every word was weighed, and every child, no matter who they were, was judged in terms of the dynasty's future. Daemon did not flee that judgment, but neither did he bow to it without resistance. From a very early age, he began to carry both the pride of belonging to this house and the pain of not fitting within its shape. Within him, two currents were already colliding, the desire to belong and the need to be different, the hunger to be loved and the urge to inspire fear, the wish to bear the bright face of the dynasty and the pull toward its darker corners. That contradiction would later leave its mark upon every stage of his life, but in childhood, it had not yet taken the clear form of contradiction. It revealed itself instead as a vague unrest, an inability to remain still, a constant searching, an endless need to prove something. The death of his father, Balon, cast the first true shadow over that restless spirit. When Balon died at what was still a relatively young age, struck down by a burst belly, the dynasty was shaken. Jaehaerys's right hand, the strongest claimant to the throne, the father of 2 sons, suddenly he was gone. Their mother, Alyssa, had died even before Balon, when Daemon was still very young, losing her life in the birth of her 3rd child. These losses left Daemon fatherless and motherless while he was still in the midst of childhood. Yet what shaped him most was not simply the grief of those losses, but the way the emptiness they left behind sent tremors through the dynasty's balance of power. With Balon's death, the question of who would one day inherit the throne flared alive once more, and the smoke of that fire began to cling to Daemon as well. He was no longer only the son of a father. He had become part of a succession crisis. His bond with Viserys deepened even further in this period. They were both orphans now. They both carried the heavy inheritance of the same dynasty and the silent echo of the same loss. Yet even their grief took different shapes. Viserys buried his pain within himself. He grew in silence, adjusted, endured. Daemon's grief turned outward, harsher in sword training, louder in the yard, more barbed toward authority. Loss did not soften him, it hardened him. For Daemon, pain was not a closing, but a kind of opening, a sharper, more demanding, more unbearable opening toward the world. And yet, beneath all that hardness, there was always a hand reaching toward Viserys. His devotion to his elder brother was one of Daemon's deepest contradictions. He loved him and envied what he possessed. He protected him and challenged him. That double tension was forged in those childhood years, and it would never truly be resolved. This was how the childhood of Daemon Targaryen passed, in a court warmed by dragon blood, yet never truly warm, beneath the shadow of lost parents, beside his elder brother, yet always one step behind him, in a world he felt was never great enough to contain him. He was not yet a warrior, nor a rebel, nor a legend, but the seeds of all these things had already been planted, each watered in turn by anger, pride, love, and the feeling of abandonment. Childhood was drawing to its end, and Daemon was preparing to step beyond courtyards, lessons, and palace corridors. He did not yet know what waited before him, but he could already feel that something within him, unnamed, still unshaped, yet irreversible, had begun to stir. The fire was growing, and fire does not like to wait. Childhood did not fall away from Daemon Targaryen like a passing season. It was stripped from him like a skin, and what emerged beneath was not softer, but harder, as that restless boy, shaped in the dust of the training yard, grew into the young man beginning to take his place. It became plain that he was not the kind of prince the court was accustomed to. Over the centuries, House Targaryen had produced every sort of child, the wise, the weak, the mad, the forgotten. Daemon resembled none of them. He was a force born of the dynasty's own blood, yet one it could not fully contain within its own shape. Brilliant, dangerous, and unbearably alive. In the years when he stepped into youth, the Red Keep was still living through the last fading stretch of Jaehaerys's long reign. The old king's authority endured, yet the uncertainty surrounding the future of the throne had already settled into every corner of the court. In such an atmosphere, Daemon emerged with striking clarity, a young prince who had already surpassed his peers in swordsmanship, begun to make his name upon the tourney field, and carried his physical gifts with the ease of natural dominion. There was challenge even in the way he moved, in his stride, in his gaze, even in his silences, which carried a weight that unsettled those around him. His identity as a warrior was not something learned. It felt rather like the long-awaited expression of something he had carried since birth. And in these same years, the bond between him and Viserys grew both deeper and more complicated. Viserys was now spoken of as one of the strongest claimants to the throne, a calm, agreeable, well-loved prince, not a threat to the order of the court, but a promise of its continuation. And beside him, Daemon remained the brother who was always a shadow, always one step behind, always a little too loud. The love between them was real, of that there can be no doubt. Viserys was the one who defended Daemon even in his hardest moments, who made space for him, who did not cast him aside. And Daemon, for his part, carried a deep, almost instinctive loyalty toward his elder brother. But beneath that loyalty lay a pain that could never fully be accepted. The knowledge that everything Viserys possessed, respect, position, the throne that awaited him, had been given not to Daemon, but to him. That knowledge did not drive Daemon away from Viserys. It did something worse. It fixed him in place as a brother who loved and envied, who protected and competed, who was devoted and yet never at peace. And that contradiction would never truly be resolved. In these years, two things entered Daemon's life that would become the clearest mirrors of who he truly was. The first was Caraxes, the bloodworm, red-scaled, long-necked, leaner than many dragons, yet far more savage. Caraxes was not beautiful, nor imposing in any ordinary sense. His power did not lie in elegance, but in the threat of his very being. The bond between him and Daemon was never a tale of taming. They resembled one another too closely, both impatient, both difficult to master, both impossible to predict once the reins were loosened. And with every ascent upon Caraxes's back, Daemon tasted a kind of freedom that lay beyond the walls of the court. And each return to the laws of the earth left him a little less able to endure them. The second was Dark Sister, forged of Valyrian steel. It was one of the oldest blades of House Targaryen, sister to Blackfire, yet not so heavy, nor so grand in its display. Dark Sister was lighter, swifter, more intimate. It was not the weapon of a commander, but of a fighter. And when Daemon began to wear that sword, the harmony between blade and bearer was so complete, it was almost unsettling. In his hand, Dark Sister was not merely an instrument of war, but a declaration of identity. I am here, I am dangerous, and I am not one to be overlooked. But the roles the dynasty assigned to Daemon would always stand at odds with the roles he chose for himself. The earliest and coldest example of this was his marriage to Rhea Royce. This union, which bound him to a noble house of the Vale, was the product of political calculation, meant to strengthen the dynasty's ties to the Vale, to grant Daemon position and lands, to fasten him to a place. But Daemon was not a man who wished to be fastened, and Rhea Royce belonged to none of the world he imagined for himself. There was neither attraction nor understanding between them. Daemon never truly accepted the marriage. Even if he did not openly defy it, he rejected it anew each day through his distance, his absence, and his indifference. He avoided going to Runestone. He avoided speaking of Rhea. The marriage remained a bond that existed on parchment, but had no life within it. And in that emptiness lay the most personal, most tangible reflection of the suffocation Daemon felt at court. A life was being imposed upon him, and he remained caught between refusing to live it and trying to flee from it. By these years, the shape of the young prince had begun to stand in full relief, brilliant with his sword, free upon his dragon, bound to his brother, and yet with each passing day, a little more estranged from the order around him. The ceremonies of the court had begun to feel too narrow for him. Protocol was suffocating him. Those around him watched with either admiration or unease, but no one remained indifferent. Daemon Targaryen was no longer a child, and though he did not yet know that the road before him would be far wider, far darker, and far bloodier than the corridors of the palace, he could already feel it. The fire was no longer a spark, it was a flame, and a flame cannot endure confinement for very long. King's Landing was 2 cities. One stood above, behind the walls of the Red Keep, beneath the shadow of the throne, within an order woven of silk and protocol. The other boiled below, in the narrow lanes of Flea Bottom, in foul waters, in those dark veins where hunger and violence ran together. These 2 cities lived within the same walls, yet pretended not to see one another. The splendor of one rested upon the misery of the other. The order of one concealed the chaos of the other, and Daemon Targaryen became one of the rare men who walked the boundary between them, not only with the privilege of a prince, but with a curiosity, a hunger, and a sense of closeness no one would have expected from one. As Viserys' steps toward the throne became clearer, Daemon's place within the life of the court began to take shape as well. After the death of King Jaehaerys, when Viserys ascended the throne, he kept his brother close. He brought him into the small council, gave him offices, and tried to secure for him a place within the order of the capital. Master of coin, master of laws, Daemon sat in these seats, yet never for long. The problem was not lack of ability. Daemon was a man who could read politics, impose authority, and alter the balance of a room the moment he entered it. The problem was that these offices could not satisfy the fire within him. To sit behind a council table, to study ledgers, to listen to the grievances of lords, in his eyes, these were not the things a prince was meant to do. The slow pace of bureaucracy was suffocating him. His impatience was not merely the absence of patience. It was the anger of a man forced to stop before the things he believed himself capable of doing. And then came the gold cloaks. When Daemon was placed at the head of the city watch, he found, for the first time, a form of power that truly felt like his own. Before him, the city guards had been a scattered, inadequate force, lacking both discipline and respect. Daemon remade them. He brought order, changed their equipment, and turned the gold cloaks into a symbol of identity. But this was more than a military reform. Through the gold cloaks, Daemon was injecting his own will into the veins of the city itself. By then, he knew the streets. He knew the brothels of Flea Bottom, the tavern corners, the dark alleys, the language of money and blood that moved through them. He was touching, from below, the world the Red Keep preferred to ignore from above. Was this the sort of thing a prince was meant to do? The court kept asking the question. Daemon did not consider it worthy of an answer, for his power now lived not in the titles the court had given him, but in the name the streets had come to know. The authority he gained through the gold cloaks turned Daemon into one of the most visible and most unsettling figures in the capital. He brought security, yes, but his methods were harsh, his punishments severe, and mercy held little place in him. He was imposing order upon the city, but it was not the sort of order the court had imagined. Daemon's justice was personal. It rested less on rules than on instinct, less on law than on will, and while this won him a kind of fear-laced respect in the city's lower depths, it also deepened the unease in the upper chambers of the court. Should a prince possess this much power in the streets? Should a Targaryen stand so close to the darkness of Flea Bottom? The man who asked those questions most loudly was Otto Hightower. As Hand of the King, Otto was charged with preserving the order of the court, and in his eyes, Daemon was the greatest threat to that order. The tension between them was ideological at its core. Otto believed that power should be maintained through institutions, protocols, and carefully measured alliances. Daemon believed that power should be personal, direct, and beyond dispute. Otto was a man of plans. Daemon was a man of action. Otto knew how to wait. Daemon did not, and Otto had begun to see Daemon's influence over Viserys, the political weight carried within that bond of brotherhood, as a danger to the future of the throne. To draw Daemon away from Viserys, to weaken his power at court, to push him to the margins. This was Otto's strategy, not openly, but quietly, drop by drop. Daemon could feel it, and that feeling made him all the more dangerous, for Daemon's most vulnerable point was never his enemies, but his brother. The bond between him and Viserys reached perhaps its most complicated form in these years. Viserys loved him. Of that, there was no doubt. But that love was no longer without condition. It had become mixed with worry, disappointment, and weariness. Daemon's excesses were wearing his elder brother down. His notoriety in the streets, his noise within the court, his disregard for protocol, all of it placed Viserys in a difficult position, not only as a king, but as a brother. For each time Viserys was forced to punish Daemon, it felt to him as though he were cutting away a piece of his own blood. And each time Daemon was punished, he did not think himself unloved, only not understood enough. It was a merciless cycle. There was love, but no true communication. There was loyalty, but trust was beginning to crack. And the distance growing between them was fed not by hatred, but by the pain of never quite being able to hold on to one another completely. King's Landing had made Daemon larger, but it had hemmed him in as well. The splendor of the city flattered his pride, yet its boundaries suffocated him. He belonged to the court, but not to its rules. He was powerful in the streets, yet that very power only made him more alone. He stood beside the throne, but the throne was not his. By now, Daemon Targaryen stood like a sword driven into the heart of the capital, gleaming, sharp, impossible to ignore, and yet with no certainty as to whose hand truly held it. That uncertainty alone was enough to unsettle the court. For Daemon Targaryen, leaving the court was not exile. It was a breath drawn at last. The walls of King's Landing, the weight of protocol, Otto Hightower's quiet hostility, Viserys's loving yet weary gaze, all of it had become a pressure that had been building upon Daemon for years, and that pressure only grew the longer he remained near the throne. For to stand beside it, yet never be allowed to sit upon it, was the kind of torment Daemon could not endure. To leave the capital was not to flee from that torment. Daemon was not a man who fled, but he had begun to understand that the thing he was searching for, that thing whose true shape even he could not yet fully name, would never be found within the Red Keep. The narrow sea offered him a front, and Daemon was a man who knew how to breathe upon a front. The stepstones, that broken chain of rocky islands scattered across the throat of the narrow sea, had long been a bleeding wound, dominated by pirates and by forces sheltered under the Triarchy. The region choked one of the vital arteries of sea trade and stood for the Seven Kingdoms as both a threat to security and a source of humiliation. The throne had shown little eagerness to resolve it. Viserys was a peace-loving king, and he had no wish to risk a direct military intervention. But Corlys Velaryon was willing to take that risk. The sea snake, the richest and most ambitious mariner in Westeros, could no longer endure the threat the stepstones posed to his trade routes. And it was at precisely this moment that Daemon came to stand beside him. This alliance was the meeting of two men who had both been pushed to the edge. Corlys was furious at the indifference the court had shown to him and his house. The rejection of his daughter Laena as a candidate for queenship, the slighting of Valyrian power, had driven him away from the throne. Daemon, meanwhile, had grown distant from the court itself. What they shared was the same hard truth. The center did not want them, and they were no longer willing to ask the center for permission. This partnership was more than a simple calculation of advantage. It was two great powers stepping out from beneath the shadow of the throne to seek a son of their own. But what they would find beneath that sun, victory, loneliness, or both at once, was not yet clear. When the war began, the stepstones ceased to be any kind of romantic stage. Cregas Drahar, the Myrish admiral, the Triarchy's hand in the stepstones, a man who used fear and torment as instruments of rule, was no easy foe. He had not been named the crab feeder without reason. By staking his captives along the tide line and leaving them to be eaten by crabs, he showed that war could be won not only with steel, but with terror, and his method of defense was built upon retreating into caves and rocky strongholds, avoiding open battle, and wearing his enemy down. It was the kind of war most opposed to Daemon's nature, a struggle that demanded patience, that exhausted rather than exalted, that rested not on glorious moments, but on muddy, bloody, repeated clashes, and the war dragged on. Months turned into years. Blood ran among the rocks of the narrow sea. Ships were lost, and soldiers died. Caraxes's fire scorched the mouths of caves, yet could not always cleanse the enemy hidden within them. In this war, Daemon was not merely a commander. He was a man who fought with his own hands, who stepped into the blood, who took wounds, who stood in the mud beside his own men. Dark Sister in his hand, Caraxes in the sky, and yet before him stood a war that not even the sky could solve. The stepstones were wearing him down. more he was worn, the harder he became. Like his sword, the more it was ground against the world, the sharper it grew. And in that war, Daemon discovered something, or perhaps something he had always known, but had never lived so plainly before. On the battlefield, there was a wholeness he had never once felt at court, a clarity within violence, a kind of honesty in the midst of blood. At court, everything was veiled, intentions, enmities, loyalties, but in war, everything stood naked. The one who killed, killed. The one who remained standing, won. Daemon's spirit was suited to that nakedness. Where the complexity of order suffocated him, the act of drawing order out of chaos gave him ease. In the end, the crab feeder was defeated. The caves fell. The stepstones passed into the control of Daemon and Corlys. And then Daemon went one step further still. He proclaimed himself king of the stepstones and the narrow sea, upon lands he had won with his own hands and his own blood. He placed a crown upon his own head in his own name. That moment was one of the clearest expressions of Daemon's entire life. The crown was not merely a symbol of victory. It was the outward form of everything he had suppressed for years. The hunger to be recognized, the need to step out from beneath his brother's shadow, the will to carve his own name with his own hand. Viserys had inherited his throne. Daemon wanted to build his own. But the foundations of that throne were rocky islands. Its army was made of weary soldiers, and its crown was a claim left pale beneath the shadow of the Iron Throne. Daemon knew this, and perhaps that is why the crown did not satisfy him. Perhaps that is why victory felt instead like the beginning of a new loneliness. And then Daemon took that crown to King's Landing. He came before Viserys, and he laid his crown, the crown he had won through blood, fire, and the force of his own defiance, at his brother's feet. That gesture was the moment when the deepest contradiction within Daemon took its clearest form. The highest point of pride and the act of surrender were joined within the same motion. Daemon was saying to the world, I am strong enough to win this, but I am yours enough to lay it before you. The hand he extended toward Viserys was not an act of submission. It was a cry, silent, heavy, yet loud enough to deafen the ears. See me, know me, I am here. Did Viserys truly see him? That cannot be known with certainty. But in that moment, the brothers drew close to one another again, perhaps for the last time in so pure a way. When Daemon returned from the stepstones, he was no longer the same man. War had enlarged him, but it had hardened him as well. Victory had given him a crown, yet even that crown had not filled the emptiness within him. He was still bound to his brother, but that bond had now become heavier, more fragile, and more dangerous. The salt of the sea still lingered upon his face, and the fire was no longer burning only within him. It had begun to break through into the world outside. War ends, but the warrior does not. When Daemon Targaryen left behind the blood and salt of the stepstones, the road before him stretched not toward another front, but toward uncertainty itself for the first time. No court was truly waiting for him now, and neither was any enemy. Before him, there was only emptiness, the kind of emptiness he had never once tried to fill. And this was no emptiness that could be cut with a sword, burned away with fire, or crossed crossed upon a dragon. In Daemon's life, the presence of Mysaria was one of the oldest and darkest echoes of that emptiness, born in Lys, risen out of slavery, and shaped in the shadows of the capital. She had entered Daemon's world through a doorway the court could never accept. What lay between them is difficult to name with any single word. Was it love, desire, the form loneliness chose to take, or the quiet fellowship of two people who both knew what it meant to live on the edge of belonging? What was known was this: Mysaria was the reflection of the life Daemon kept outside the court, of the unofficial bonds, of the feelings left to exist in shadow. In the formal shape of his life, her presence was invisible, and yet her absence was never complete. She came like a shadow and withdrew like a shadow, and Daemon was a man who knew how to live with shadows. But shadows do not build a home, and Daemon, perhaps for the first time in his life, wanted to build one. Laena Velaryon was the truest possibility ever to stand before that desire. The daughter of Corlys Velaryon, the silver-haired heir of her house, a dragon rider, a woman who rose into the sky upon the back of Vhagar. Laena was the very opposite of the cold, soulless, parchment-bound marriage Daemon had endured with Rhea Royce. There was life in this union, movement, reciprocity. Laena was a strong woman, not one diminished in Daemon's presence, but one who could stand beside him as an equal. She carried dragon blood, she carried courage, and perhaps most importantly, she possessed an instinct that did not need the language of the court in order to understand Daemon's world. This marriage created one of the rare moments of balance in Daemon's life. Not a perfect balance, for nothing in his life was ever truly whole, but something closer to it than he had perhaps ever known. Pentos was the stage upon which that fragile balance was played out. Across the narrow sea, far from the political convulsions of Westeros, a life took shape amid the cosmopolitan air of the free cities. Here, far from the corridors of the Red Keep and the tensions of the small council, Daemon tasted the possibility of another kind of existence. The mild winds of Pentos, the mingling of foreign tongues, the strange lightness of a place untouched by the full weight of his dynasty. All of it offered him room to breathe, but that breathing space was not a homeland. Daemon lived in Pentos, yet he did not belong to Pentos. The crown of the West still lingered in his mind, the shadow of the Red Keep still lay across his shoulders, and the voice of Viserys still echoed in his ears. Exile was a matter of geography, but the burden Daemon carried did not change with geography. It was in this period that Daemon became a father. Baela and Rhaena, the two daughters, Laena bore him. Their presence brought into Daemon's life a layer that had never truly touched it before: vulnerability. Daemon might be unbreakable upon the battlefield, intolerable within the court, and capable of imposing his own will even in exile. But the helpless, unguarded, naked feeling a father carries toward his children was something that, for the first time, reached the skin beneath his armor. Baela and Rhaena carried the blood of House Targaryen. They were the continuation of the dragon line. But to Daemon, they were not merely the continuation of a bloodline. They were proof that another kind of life might be possible, that love could exist in a form untouched by violence, that remaining could itself be a kind of courage. And yet, Daemon was not a man who knew how to remain. The peace of Pentos did not soothe him. In time, it began to press upon him instead. The life he shared with Laena was beautiful, but beauty had never been enough to satisfy Daemon. The hunger within him was not the kind that could be quieted by love alone, or by family, or by the warmth of a roof overhead. There was something in him that never ceased to move, a relentless current driving him from one place to another, from one war to the next, from one fracture to one return. Westeros was calling to him. The throne was calling to him. The greatness of his own name was calling to him. The years he spent in Pentos were the quietest of Daemon's life, but that quiet was not peace. It was a waiting room. Did Laena feel it? Most likely. Strong women are often the first to sense the restless wind inside the man they love. Yet, what would bring this chapter to its end was not Daemon's unease, but a far crueler intervention of fate, and that moment had not yet come. For now, Daemon lived across the narrow sea, far from the court, far from war, and yet never truly far from himself. One hand stroked the hair of his daughters, the other still reached, almost without thinking, for the hilt of his sword. One eye rested upon the horizon of Pentos, the other remained turned toward Westeros. This was the period in which Daemon Targaryen came closest to peace, and perhaps, for that very reason, it was also his most fragile. When Laena died, something in Daemon's world closed, quietly, like a heavy door. What remained behind it was not grief alone, but the extinguishing of a possibility. That other life, built in the mild air of Pentos beneath the shadow of dragons. That life which had seemed, for a time, possible beyond the weight of dynasty, beyond the shadow of the throne, beyond the filthy politics of the capital, dispersed like vapor with Laena's final breath. Daemon was left behind with two daughters, Baela and Rhaena, two small lives carrying dragon blood, motherless, and bound to a father in a world where even he no longer knew where he truly belonged. In Daemon's language, grief spoke through silence. He did not set aside his sword. He did not descend from the back of Caraxes, and the expression on his face still showed the outside world the same Daemon it had always known. But within, something had changed. The life he had built with Laena had drawn out a softness even Daemon himself had perhaps never fully recognized, and now the emptiness left in its place did not make him harder. It left him more open, not vulnerable in the ordinary sense, ready, as though fate, in order to drive him toward whatever came next, had first needed to take from him what he still possessed, and that next step would lead him toward a direction he had known since childhood. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the daughter of Viserys, the named heir to the throne, the dynasty's most contested promise. The bond between Daemon and Rhaenyra was not new. It reached back into childhood, to the years when they walked the corridors of the court side by side, and Daemon showed the young princess a world beyond the walls of the Red Keep. Even then, there was a closeness between them, poised upon the boundary between uncle and niece, yet already carrying an energy ready to stretch beyond that line. The court had always watched that closeness with unease. In Otto Hightower's eyes, it was one of those dangers that had to be contained, and over the years, that bond had been tested by distance, by exile, by other marriages, by other lives, all in an effort to sever it. But it had never truly been severed, only postponed. Now, in the wake of Laena, and beneath the shadow left by Laenor Velarion's death, when the paths of Daemon and Rhaenyra met again, that meeting was no accident. It was gravity. Both had endured loss. Both had been left alone within the dynasty. Both had been crushed, cast aside, and tested between the promises of the throne and the truth of it. Daemon had been driven away from the court. Rhaenyra had been left alone at the very heart of it. They were two faces of the same coin, and that coin was the mingled gold and blood of House Targaryen. The pull between them cannot be read as some ordinary desire. Certainly, there was passion there. Daemon was never a man made to conceal longing, and Rhaenyra had never fully fit the court's ideal of the chaste and compliant princess. But to explain their union only through bodily attraction would be to diminish it. To Daemon, Rhaenyra was the living extension of the throne he had never been allowed to claim. Viserys' daughter, yes, but also the bearer of the very thing Viserys had never given him. And to Rhaenyra, Daemon was the embodied form of the strength, daring, and recklessness the world had denied her, a man who refused to bow to the rules of the court, who carried authority within his very presence. These two did not merely complete one another, they magnified one another, and that growth was dangerous, both for them and for the realm. Their marriage was the formal shaping of that danger. The union of Daemon and Rhaenyra meant far more than a wedding held in the courts of the Red Keep. It meant that the two most ambitious currents of Targaryen blood were now flowing in the same channel. It meant that the named heir to the throne had taken to her side the most dangerous and most seasoned prince of the dynasty. Politically, the marriage was a move that strengthened Rhaenyra's claim, even as it set her enemies on edge. The Hightower faction, Alicent and Otto above all, saw in this union not merely a family bond, but the quiet form of a declaration of war. And they were not wrong, for Daemon was no longer standing at the margins. Years of distance, exile, war, lost wives, abandoned crowns, and accusations cast aside had kept Daemon far from the center of the dynasty. But now, beside Rhaenyra, with their children around them, beneath the shadow of Caraxes, and with Dark Sister at his hip, Daemon had returned to the very place from which he had long been held apart, the foot of the throne itself. And this return was not the loud, unruly entrance of his younger years. It was heavier, more deliberate, more dangerous. For this time, Daemon did not stand only in his own name, but in the name of a cause, Rhaenyra's cause, the cause of being recognized as the rightful heir to the throne, had now become his as well. And when Daemon bound himself to a cause, he became both its greatest weapon and its greatest risk. Dragonstone had now become the center of this new life. Not the Red Keep, not yet, but upon the dark rocks of Dragonstone, in the hard wind off the sea, beneath skies where dragons wheeled together, Daemon and Rhaenyra began to build a new order around themselves. Children were born. Aegon and Viserys, Daemon's sons, future claimants to the throne, the blood-written continuation of the dynasty. To those looking in from the outside, this family growing upon Dragonstone seemed strong, united, and resolute, and in many ways it was. But within Daemon himself, there was still an unease, the kind that could never be fully named and never truly extinguished. He loved Rhaenyra, of that there was no doubt. But for Daemon, love and peace had never once been the same thing. And beyond them, in the depths of the court, a storm was gathering. Viserys was growing old. His health had begun to fail. With each passing day, the future of the throne was becoming more uncertain. The high towers were preparing their own candidate, Aegon, the son Viserys had by Alicent. The Greens and the Blacks had not yet taken their formal names, but the lines had already been drawn, and Daemon stood at the very heart of one of those lines, no longer at the margins, no longer in exile, no longer merely a restless prince. He was now a man who could hear the thunder of war approaching, who was preparing for that thunder, and perhaps even calling it forth. Fire had drawn near to fire, and when two fires come together, what follows is not warmth. When Viserys died, Daemon did not lose only a brother. The oldest, deepest, and most contradictory bond of his life was severed, quietly, finally, beyond recall. For years, that bond had been strained, thinned, and splintered, yet it had never wholly broken. Now it had, and in the emptiness left behind by what had been torn away, Daemon did not find grief, but anger. For Daemon was not a man who grieved in stillness. Grief asks for quiet. Daemon was a spirit incapable of remaining still. Pain did not slow him. It hastened him, hardened him. Like the honing of a blade, every loss made him sharper, colder, more dangerous. But the death of Viserys was not only the loss of a brother, it was the death of an order as well. For all his failings, Viserys had been the last glue holding the dynasty together. His presence, gentle, conciliatory, and steadfast in its faith in peace, had been the one force keeping two hostile factions beneath the same roof. When he died, that roof collapsed. The Greens moved at once. Aegon, the son Viserys had by Alicent, was crowned in the Red Keep. Rhaenyra's right of succession, declared years before, was stolen in a single night. The rightful heir to the throne was cast out from her own father's court. This was no longer merely a struggle over a crown. It was the moment when Targaryen blood turned in upon itself, when dragons were drawn up against dragons, when a dynasty began to devour its own children. The dance of the dragons. The name was beautiful. The truth of it was horrific. The Black Council gathered on Dragonstone was the first breath of war. Rhaenyra was resolved to defend her right as the rightful heir to the throne. And beside her, at the other end of the table, sat Daemon, with Dark Sister at his hip, and a resolve in his eyes, fiercer than anything the court had ever seen in him before. In that council, Daemon was not merely a husband or an advisor. He was the only man in the room who truly spoke the language of war. While the others spoke of diplomacy, alliances, and letters, Daemon spoke of dragons, fronts, and blood. This was not barbarity. It was realism. Daemon was experienced enough to see clearly what the enemy had done, and ruthless enough to know what they would do next. The Greens had taken the throne. Words would not be enough to take it back. Fire would be required. And Daemon was a man who thought in the language of fire. His relationship with Rhaenyra took on a new shape in this period. The bond they had shared in the mild nights of Pentos had become something else upon the storm-racked rocks of Dragonstone. There was still love between them, yes, but now it was a love pressed beneath the weight of war, tangled with strategic calculation, breathing beneath the shadow of loss and threat. Daemon stood beside Rhaenyra, but he did not always share her methods. When Rhaenyra hesitated, Daemon wanted to move. When Rhaenyra sought peace, Daemon was making plans for war. This tension did not tear them apart, not yet, but the distance between them had begun to make itself felt, even when they sat within the same room. Daemon's loyalty was beyond question, but loyalty and harmony are not the same thing. And Daemon moved Harrenhal, the greatest, darkest, most accursed castle in all Westeros. The vast stronghold Aegon the Conqueror had melted with dragon fire, whose stones still seemed to bear the scars of that burning, and where, it was said, every lord who dwelt within met a grim end. Daemon rode to seize this castle for the Blacks and to establish a stronghold in the Riverlands. From a strategic standpoint, the decision was sound. Harrenhal was a key point at the center of the continent, and whoever held it could alter the course of the war. But Harrenhal was never merely a castle. It was a place that felt like the outward reflection of Daemon's inner world, immense, dark, ruined, a structure in which power and curse were bound tightly together. And there, in the heart of the war, Daemon began to descend ever deeper. His time at Harrenhal changed Daemon. The castle was empty, cold, its vast halls filled with echo, and at night the wind passed through the melted towers like a moan. Here, Daemon gathered armies, bent lords to obedience, and built the logistics of war. But in doing so, he became ever more alone, more severe, and more closed within himself. Sleeplessness, visions, confrontations with the ghosts of the past. Harrenhal's hold over Daemon was not merely physical. That castle deepened the darkness within him, the recklessness of his youth, the savage energy of the battlefield, the defiance he had once carried at court. All of it was giving way to a colder, more calculating, more merciless resolve. Daemon was becoming a man who no longer laughed, no longer joked, no longer left room for softness. War was erasing him, layer by layer, stripping away everything human until only will and violence remained. Blood and cheese. This name belongs to one of the darkest pages of the war, remembered as one of the most ominous tales of how far Daemon's shadow may have reached. The details remain disputed, but the horror itself is certain. On that night, when brutality was turned into a weapon in order to drive fear into the enemy's heart, Daemon's name fell across it as well. The deed made him one of the most feared figures in the war, but it also tore away yet another piece of his humanity. What Rhaenyra truly felt when she learned of it can never be known with certainty, but it is certain that the distance between them widened once again. Daemon Targaryen had now become the sword of the Black Queen, but swords do not feel, and Daemon was becoming a man who felt less and less. In the dark halls of Harrenhal, bent over maps of war, with Dark Sister at his side and Caraxes waiting below in the yard like a shifting red shadow. Daemon was no longer a man living within war. He was becoming war itself, and a man who becomes war cannot return to peace. Only one thing remained now, the end, and the end had already begun to walk toward him. As war draws toward its end, it grows quieter. The clash of swords, the roar of dragons, the crackling of burning cities. After a certain point, all of it becomes a single noise, and beneath that noise, a deeper silence begins to swell, unheard by those still trapped within it. Daemon Targaryen could hear that silence. Perhaps he had heard it for some time already. Perhaps in the nights he spent among the melted towers of Harrenhal. Perhaps while bent over maps of war. Perhaps each time he rose into the sky upon Caraxes' back. The silence was telling him that the end had come, not as a prophecy, but as a fact, and Daemon was never a man who fled from what was real. He never had been. Daemon Targaryen, the second son Viserys had by Alicent, the one-eyed prince, the rider of Vhagar, the sharpest sword of the Greens. The enmity between Daemon and Aemond reached back to long before the war, but the war had enlarged it, deepened it, made it inevitable. The tension between them was not merely the hostility of opposing sides. It ran deeper than that, more personal, almost like looking into a mirror. Aemond was a younger and crueler reflection of Daemon himself. The same pride, the same violence, the same ferocity, but without the depth Daemon had earned through years, and without the weight that loss had taught him to carry. Did Daemon see this? Most likely. The man before him was a ghost of his own youth, uncontrollable, fearless, and bound to nothing beyond himself. And to face that ghost was something very close to reckoning with his own life. As the two armies, the two dragons, and the two wills drew closer around Harrenhal, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. The lords of the region had either fled or fallen silent in fear. Across the riverlands hung the sense of an approaching catastrophe, not the kind read in dark clouds, but the kind written in the pallor of men's faces. Daemon waited. He was not patient, he never had been, but this time the waiting was deliberate. He did not refrain from haste because he was afraid. He refrained because he understood the weight of what was coming. At night, he went to Caraxes. He laid his hand upon the red dragon's warm hide. The bond between them now lived in a place beyond the reach of words. They had flown together for years, fought together, grown older together. Caraxes was Daemon's last faithful companion, nearer than his sword, more enduring even than his brother. And then the end came. The gods' high, the great lake at the heart of Westeros, with islands upon its surface, legends in its depth, and some of the oldest secrets of history sleeping beneath its dark and motionless waters. When Daemon rose into the sky upon the back of Caraxes, Aemond and Vhagar stood before him. Vhagar, the greatest of the living dragons, the oldest, the heaviest, the ancient beast once ridden by Visenya, sister to Aegon the Conqueror. The shadow of Vhagar alone could break the courage of an army. When her wings spread wide, they seemed to swallow the sky. Beside her, Caraxes was smaller, leaner, swifter. But upon Caraxes rode Daemon, and upon Daemon rested the weight of an entire life. When the two dragons met above the god's eye, the sky split in two. The chroniclers tell this duel in different ways. Some witnesses say the fire lit the whole lake. Others claim the screams of the dragons could be heard for miles. But this much is certain. Caraxes and Vhagar locked themselves upon one another. Claws in flesh, teeth in wing, fire against fire. The clash that began in the sky ended with the two immense bodies twisted together as they fell toward the water. But before they struck, Daemon, dark sister in hand, freed from his saddle chains, leapt from the back of Caraxes, downward from above, from his own dragon onto his enemy. It is said that he drove dark sister through Aemon's blind eye. That moment was the whole of Daemon Targaryen's life distilled into a single motion, a move from which there could be no return, weighed in full, with its cost already known. In that instant, Daemon was not only killing an enemy, he was choosing his own end. Everything he had carried since childhood, pride, anger, love, grief, fire, loneliness, was poured into that one leap. From sky to water, from life to death, from history into legend, Vhagar and Aemon sank into the depths of the god's eye. Caraxes, with his wounded body, dragged himself to the lake's shore, and there, beneath the walls of the castle, gave his last breath. But Daemon's body was never found. Dark Sister was recovered from the waters much later, still driven through Aemon's skull. But the body of Daemon Targaryen, that body which had never known stillness, which was always in motion, which had never fully fit anywhere, never rose again into the light. And perhaps that is the most fitting end for him. For Daemon Targaryen was never a completed man. Nothing in his life had ever been complete. Not his peace, not his sense of belonging, not his love, not his anger. Everything had always remained unfinished, always spilled into the next step, always left something behind. A death without a funeral, an end without a grave, a body never found. These were not a contradiction of Daemon's life, but a continuation of its very nature. He was a sentence that never closed, a fire that was never fully spent, and history does not forget what remains unfinished. It turns it into legend. After Daemon, the legends only grew. Some made a hero of him, the great warrior who gave himself for his house, who fought to his final breath, who cast his enemy from the sky to the earth. Others cursed his name, a cruel man of blood, dangerous enough to drag even his own family toward ruin. And some said both at once, because Daemon was one of those rare men who carried both within him. He was never wholly a hero, nor wholly a monster, never wholly loyal, nor wholly treacherous, never wholly loving, nor wholly destructive. He was fire itself, the same flame that gives warmth and burns. The waters of the god's eye have long since grown still. The walls of Harrenhal have long since passed into the hands of other lords. The age of dragons has long since come to its end, and yet the name of Daemon Targaryen is still spoken, in whispers, in admiration, in fear, or in all three at once. For some fires go on giving warmth even after they have died, and some names do not fall silent, even after they are buried. And so the story of Daemon Targaryen, passing through fire, pride, war, and loss, slowly fades into the silence of the night, What remains is the long shadow of a name that once rose into the sky beside dragons, neither wholly absolved nor wholly damned, but too great ever to be forgotten. If this dark journey kept you company tonight, you can join these quiet chronicles by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if you wish, you can also write in the comments where in the world and at what hour you joined this story. Now let the fire go out, let the halls fall silent, and let the rest of the night tell what remains in whispers.